Hello, everyone. We'll be starting in 2 minutes. Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to our Zoom call this evening. I'm just going to explain some of the technical features of this call. Just so you're aware, it's a webinar format, so you will only see the speakers. You can post a question in the Q&A function. You can also use the chat box. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Closed Caption. If you press that button, you'll be able to turn subtitles on. That will provide live subtitles of this call. If you press View Transcript, you will be able to see a transcript of this call on the right-hand side. If you have any technical questions or you need assistance, please type in the chat box and a member of the NEU team will be able to help you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our chair for this evening, Gwen Little. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Mike. And we're just going to we've got lots of people joining at the moment. We're just going to give another minute or so for people to be joining, and then we'll get started. So another minute or so. While you're waiting, please do feel free to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat. And please do have a read of the NEU's behaviour statement, which has been posted in the chat. Just to summarise, really clear, we will not tolerate any harassment or discrimination in any of these meetings, and anyone behaving in such a manner will be ejected from the meeting. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for a few more people to join, please do introduce yourselves, say hello to each other, and we'll get started in about a minute's time. There are just 85 of you in the call at the moment, and it's still rising, so fantastic to see you all. Fantastic. We've now got over 100 of you joining us in this chat, and I believe we're also live streaming it to YouTube. I'll say a bit more about that later on, but welcome to everyone who's joined us for today's meeting. Before we begin, just a couple of technical aspects about this meeting. It is in webinar format, which means that your video and your microphones won't be switched on during the meeting. So we are recording the meeting and it is being live streamed, but other than our panelists, you won't be seen in that. So there's no need to worry around that. It does mean that if you've got questions that you'd like to pose to our panelists, we've got a number of excellent panelists today, and also the opportunity to pose questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a box marked Q&A. It's next to the chat box, but please don't use the chat box. Please use the Q&A. If you've got any questions you'd like to put to the panelists, you can type them into that box either now while the panelists are speaking or after they've spoken. And what we'll do is we'll take a selection of questions from those submitted. We'll try and get as many as we can, but we probably won't be able to answer all of your questions, but we'll take a selection of those and put them to our panelists for today. So welcome everybody. One final reminder of the NEU's behaviour statement, which is posted in the chat, but it's very, very simple. We don't tolerate any discriminatory behaviour or harassment, and anyone indulging in any of that behaviour will be ejected from the meeting. Okay, so I am very, very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on the Cuban education system. It's one of a series of webinars that the NEU International Department has been putting on over recent weeks, and also one of a series of webinars hosted by the Cuba Solidarity over recent weeks. We're really, really pleased to be working with the Cuba Solidarity campaign in order to bring you today's panel and today's discussion. So you're very, very welcome. My name's Gawain Little, and I'm chair of the National Education Union's International Committee, and I'll be chairing your meeting this evening. We've got a fantastic range of speakers, but also hopefully the opportunity for a few questions to be put to our panelists at the end of the meeting. We will definitely be finishing by 7:30 p.m. If you have got questions that you would like to ask of our panelists, please use the question and answer box at the bottom of the page. There's a Q&A box down there. If you click on that, you can type your questions in. So I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us tonight, both the participants who have joined us on Zoom here, but also all those others who'll be watching live on YouTube, both here and in Cuba. We want this meeting to focus on the Cuban education system, but of course we'll need to view that against the backdrop of the current coronavirus crisis. Now, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the work of Cuba's international medical brigades. Amazingly, they've sent over 30 medical brigades to countries across the globe during the current crisis. They've received praise and awards for their work all over the world in emergency situations, and also for their long-term placements to provide healthcare in some of the poorest and most remote countries on the planet. So it should come as no surprise that Cuba has responded to this current health emergency the way that it has. And I know from our contacts in Cuba that the country itself has responded amazingly to the crisis, and infection rates and recovery rates are very, very low, and recovery rates have been strong, thanks to the country's wonderful healthcare system. Now, we've got a fantastic panel for you today. We've got Bernard Regan of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. We've got two of our delegates, Lucy Coleman and Malcolm Richards, from previous NEU Solidarity delegations to Cuba. And I'm also pleased to say we'll be joined by Niurka Gonzalez, the General Secretary of the Cuban Education Union. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But I also wanted to welcome today as well, watching along with you, our special guest, Barbara Elena Montalvo Alvarez, Her Excellency, the Cuban Ambassador. So I am sure that you are aware of the difficulties imposed by the continuing US blockade of Cuba. This is a blockade which not only affects countries trading directly with Cuba, it affects any company that attempts to trade with Cuba, and it places huge restrictions on what the Cuban people have access to, and huge restrictions on their development, all because of the US's disagreement with the Cuban people's choice of government. It isn't just travel restrictions, it affects all kinds of things, including online apps. So unfortunately, we were really, really keen to have Niurka Gonzalez, the General Secretary of the Cuban Education Union, join us today. But because of the blockade, Cubans aren't allowed to access Zoom. Therefore, what we've done is the director of Cuba Solidarity, Rob Miller, was able to interview Niurka earlier in the week, to record that interview to be shared with you today. So we are really, really pleased to welcome Niurka. I believe she's also watching live in Cuba now. Really, really pleased to welcome Niurka as our first speaker, and I will hand you over to her. Mike, if you would do the honors and start the interview with Niurka. Thank you.
Sí, mira, nosotros, bueno, como ustedes conocen, en Cuba entró la pandemia, el coronavirus, el 11 de marzo por el municipio de SNTECD, el municipio de Trinidad, en la provincia de SNTECD, a través de 3 extranjeros que visitaron nuestro país. Ya desde antes nuestro país se venía preparando a través de indicaciones y acciones que el gobierno había establecido de conjunto con el Ministerio de Salud Pública para enfrentar esta pandemia. Nosotros desde el sindicato y de conjunto con la CTC y los otros sindicatos también nos habíamos trazado ya un plan de acciones delimitando los maestros y los profesores que debían estar en sus casas porque tenían enfermedades y podían ser más vulnerables a esta enfermedad, adoptando todas las medidas sanitarias en nuestros centros educacionales y deportivos, universidades, y un sinnúmero de actividades que de conjunto con la CTC y el gobierno empezamos a establecer a partir de ese 11 de marzo que ya se reportaron los 3 primeros casos en nuestro país. De ahí, bueno, como ustedes conocen, el curso escolar se detuvo el 25 de marzo. Esto es algo que tuvo una connotación muy importante en el país porque por primera vez en Cuba eso sucedía. Aquí, por ejemplo, tras el paso de ciclones o algún evento meteorológico, el curso se había detenido por 3, 4 días, cuando más una semana. Pero detenerse el curso por completo, como esta vez, eso es algo que no tenía precedentes en nuestro país. Y el día 25 de marzo las actividades de posgrado y de pregrado se detuvieron tanto en la educación general como en la educación superior. A partir de ahí, bueno, se empezó a implementar ese sistema de acciones y estrategias que te decía anteriormente, habíamos coordinado de conjunto el sindicato con los organismos que atendemos. Empezamos a hacer videoconferencias desde acá, desde la Dirección Nacional del Sindicato y del resto de los organismos que atendemos, con los directores provinciales de educación en las diferentes provincias, con los rectores, para desde aquí, como no nos podíamos mover hacia las provincias y ellos tampoco podían venir hacia acá, pues bueno, esa fue la vía que se determinó para que ellos recibieran las indicaciones y nosotros a la vez poder retroalimentarnos de qué cosa estaba pasando en cada una de las escuelas, de los centros y de las universidades. Dentro de nuestros centros educacionales, 116 centros educacionales dentro de escuelas y universidades estuvieron funcionando como centros de aislamiento. ¿A qué llamamos centros de aislamiento? Aquellos centros donde se ubicaban a los que eran sospechosos a la COVID. Y allí estuvieron en esas universidades y en esos centros, en esas escuelas nuestras, nuestros trabajadores, nuestros afiliados, demostrando una solidaridad inmensa allí con los sospechosos que podían o no podían estar enfermos, pero era un riesgo. Y debo decirte que esto fue una labor voluntaria. O sea, a ninguno de nuestros profesores, a ninguno de nuestros afiliados, nuestros maestros, nuestros trabajadores no docentes se le obligó a estar allí. Fue voluntario, demostrando su solidaridad, su humanismo, su altruismo, valores que por supuesto sabes que nos ha inculcado nuestra revolución. Y cómo no, mira, a partir de que se detuvo el curso escolar el día 25 de marzo, todas las educaciones, todas las clases se empezaron a transmitir por la televisión. Aquí en Cuba tenemos un canal que es el canal educativo y con un esfuerzo inmenso por la prontitud con que se elaboraron estas clases a través del Ministerio de Educación, se planificaron, se programaron estas clases en colaboración con el canal educativo, con la televisión, y todas las educaciones, todos los niños, desde la primera infancia hasta la última educación, estuvieron recibiendo sus clases a través de la televisión, a través de clases. Esto fue muy acogido por los niños, por los padres, siempre alguna que otra pero la marcha lo fuimos solucionando y en esta medida conferencia que estaba al principio, pues ahí también los directores provinciales informaban Nosotros
Okay, we're experiencing significant difficulties with the video. Are you able to stop the video? Please? Thank you. We seem to have some technical difficulties there, which I'm sure people were well aware of. The video works fine. A lot of people are saying in the chat that if we could show it with the sound off, they'd be able to read the subtitles very, very clearly, as I know most of the people on this chat here are listening along in English. Mike, restart the video from this point with the sound off. My apologies for that technical difficulty. We will work out what it is, but probably after the meeting. But for now, you can watch the rest of Niurka's contribution. Thank you. Thank you so much, Niurka, for joining us. And it just goes to show that we won't let any technical issues, whether it is the US blockade disallowing Zoom in Cuba, or whether it is the technology making the audio crash at this end, we won't allow any technological difficulties to get in the way of our work together. A link to that recording will be made available to participants afterwards, so that you'll be able to watch it with the sound. But I just want to say, Niurka, thank you so much for joining us. The Cuban internationalism during this pandemic and outside of the pandemic is an inspiration to all of us. And we are very, very proud in the National Education Union to be able to do our little bit to stand in solidarity with you through the delegations we send, through the cooperation we have with the Cuba Solidarity Campaign here, and through our relationship with your union. And let me say, on behalf of our union, we will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with you against that illegal US blockade, which does so much harm to your country and to your people. I'm really pleased now to welcome our next speaker. Our next speaker will be known to many of you, particularly anyone who's been involved in Cuba solidarity work, because it's none other than Bernard Regan. Bernard is the National Secretary of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. He's also a trustee of the National Education Union and long-standing NEU activist. And he has been very involved in initiating and supporting the past 4 NEU delegations to Cuba. So Bernard, you are very, very welcome. As I say, we're pleased to be hosting this meeting jointly with the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. And the floor is yours, Bernard. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Gawain. And can I add my support to your comments of greetings to Niurka, of solidarity with the teachers union in Cuba and with the Cuban people and the Cuban trade unions. I was reminded during her speech about one session when we had a delegation and we were in Havana talking to the National Education Union in Cuba. And one of our delegates said to Niurka, what happens if you have a disagreement with the government about policies that they're proposing to introduce? And for a moment, there was complete silence in the room and people didn't understand why there was no response. And Niurka and her colleague who was with her on the top table were looking at each other. And eventually they said, can you repeat the question? We don't understand it. Anyway, it was clear from the end of her talk that what she was saying was that it was impossible for anything to happen in the field of education which the teachers in Cuba hadn't been involved in discussing and planning and putting together and then ultimately agreeing to go ahead with. And I was just comparing what she was saying about COVID-19 and the challenges that Cuba faces with that, with which it's dealing remarkably, as you said at the beginning, and as Niurka said in her contribution, just comparing that to what is happening to teachers in Britain in terms of the way in which the government has shown little regard for the concerns, quite rightly, that the National Education Union has expressed about how social distancing will operate in schools, how teachers will manage the school situation, and so on. And I just thought it was interesting, her comments about that, where she went into detail, explaining all of the steps that were being taken, the way in which systematically it was being planned and thought through, and at every stage, teachers were engaged in trying to resolve what the difficulties might be. And I think there are many teachers in this Zoom who probably would wish that that were the case here in Britain. And I'm sure would echo those sentiments. Jumping ahead, on Sunday, it's the 26th of July. And the 26th of July in Cuba is a very famous celebration because it's a celebration of an event which really marked the beginning of the revolutionary process in Cuba. And that was the raid on the Moncada barracks by Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Vilma Espin and others, trying to overthrow the dictatorship of Batista, which they succeeded in doing eventually, of course, in 1959. And the reason I mention it is not just because it's a historic day in Cuba, but also because that barracks, along with virtually every other military installation that existed under dictatorship, have in fact been turned into schools or educational institutions. In Havana, when we went to visit there on a delegation, we went to visit a school for the visually impaired called Abel Santa Maria. And we also visited the Literacy Museum. Sorry, both of those are situated on a very large campus, which formerly was the headquarters of the dictator Fulgencio Batista, and his military equipment was all there, and his military resources and so on. And I think in a sense that in a nutshell summarizes what Cuba is about, turning barracks into schools, turning those institutions into places of education in which children benefit, young people benefit, and education is free completely throughout the whole of the age range in Cuba, right up to university education and postgraduate education. Again, we went on another story. We went on a visit to Pina del Rio, to the university there. And I remember a large session in which there were more than 100 students participating with us. And we were talking about education and the challenges of education in England and in Cuba. And one of the questions that came up is, how do you manage going to university? How does it work in England? One of the young teachers who was on the delegation talked about having just a few years ago completed his degree, but then went on to explain to the Cuban students that he had £50,000 worth of debt that he had to repay as a result of the way in which education worked in Cuba. And the place went deathly silent. There was an absolute disbelief from the Cuban students who were there and the teachers and all of the participants, because they couldn't understand that. Education in Cuba, as you will hear many times, I'm sure, during the course of this session, is absolutely free right through to postgraduate era. And education has been at the center, not only, as I said, turning the barracks into educational institutions, but from the literacy campaign, which began the first year of the revolution itself, with more than 100,000 young people between the ages of 10 and 18 going out into the countryside and the neighborhoods engaged in a massive literacy campaign. 13,000 factory workers and workers inside Cuba teaching their fellow workers how to read, how to write, and also 15,000 teachers going out into the remote areas so that even the farthest and most remote parts of Cuba in the mountains were actually had access to this literacy program. And within a period of about 6 months or 8 months, educational impact in Cuba was colossal. From a situation of having literacy rate of around about 44%, it's shot up to over 90%. And that commitment to literacy was part of a process of saying that actually through education, people are liberated, through engaging with education. So I think that just the point I really want to make and emphasize is the extent to which education is absolutely at the center of Cuban life. It isn't just something that's a peripheral add-on. And the economy and the way the economy is made and the priorities of education, of spending in the economy, are directed towards that. And Cuba has played a part in literacy campaigns, not only in its own country, but indeed in many other countries across the globe. And as a result of that, has won prizes from UNESCO in recognition of its campaign called Yo Si Puedo, which was a literacy campaign which has been used in many, many countries, including places like New Zealand and Spain and other countries in the world, and has been effective in transforming those countries, in creating a literate society in which people can engage fully and have control over their own lives. And all of that, of course, even and despite, as Niurka said, the colossal pressures that Cuba faces as a result of the blockade carried out by the United States of America. She made reference to it, so I won't go through all of the details, but just to say and to emphasize that that actually is ratcheting up and is getting worse at this point in time with President Donald Trump, who has imposed even further restrictions and attacks on Cuba. And two things which are very problematic at this time, and of course she referred to as well, is that tourism is an important part of Cuba's income. And so without tourists, it actually is suffering economically. And also with the situation of COVID-19, that's a challenge as well. But even in the face of that, Cuba has maintained its concern for its own population and for populations abroad. So it's sent medics to more than 20 countries. It's had doctors in places like Italy, Andorra, and in countries in 4 continents across the globe. And in the course of that, it's won really widespread recognition for its humanitarianism, for its concern for people's well-being and for their lives. And it's not a surprise, and I think it's fully justified, that from Italy, there is a call for those doctors and those medics to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their selflessness, for their humanitarianism, for their concern for the well-being of others, without any preconditions, without asking for 100% support for Cuba from people, no conditions in terms of that. And I'll conclude on this. I think it's very clear that Cuba is a society in which human beings are valued and are put at the forefront in terms of education, in terms of health. And I think it's only right that at the United Nations General Assembly last year, 187 countries voted against that blockade and called for it to be ended, including Britain. I think our task here in Britain, I hope, will be to continue to persuade our government to stand by that, not to be forced or to be obliged or to move, as we've seen recently over the Huawei issue in relation to China, not to be pressured into supporting the United States inhuman attacks on Cuba, but rather to stand with Cuba in solidarity and against that. I hope that will be the case. I hope if you are not already members, that some of you will think about joining the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, affiliating your local districts of the National Education Union or other unions if there are other colleagues from other unions on this call, and also to make clear that it's important that we stand with Cuba. We stand on the side of those who are fighting for a better world and for changes in the world that put human beings, put education, put health to the forefront. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bernard, for joining us. And thank you for that passionate exposition of the key issues in terms of our solidarity with Cuba. I think it's absolutely vital. And as I said earlier, we are so proud to work alongside the Cuba Solidarity Campaign here in order to express our solidarity, not only with our sister union, but with the Cuban people. One of the main forms that solidarity takes is the solidarity delegations, which Niurka referred to in her contribution. The NEU has sent delegations now for a number of years, solidarity delegations of teachers, classroom teachers. Any union member can apply to go on one of these delegations, and they visit schools in Cuba, they meet with the education union in Cuba, they visit a number of other places to really find out firsthand about the Cuban education system and to share that experience back home. Recently, jointly with the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, we published a book which brings together the experiences of many of these delegates. Again, Niurka referred to it in her talk, got a copy here. It's called Beyond the Blockade, Education in Cuba, and it really is a fantastic explanation of the various experiences that people have had out there and what they came to understand about the Cuban education system. So I'm really, really pleased to welcome as our next speaker, one of the delegates who participated in the 2018 Solidarity Delegation Cuba and who also contributed to the book Beyond the Blockade. Lucy Coleman is the Assistant Secretary of Oxfordshire NEU, and is going to talk about her experiences in Cuba as part of that 2018 delegation. Lucy, you're very, very welcome, and the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to take part today. It's been really inspiring to hear from Niurka and Bernard, who's a really hard act to follow, but I will try. So as Gawain said, in October 2018, I was lucky enough to be one of the 25 teachers from the NEU that took part in the annual delegation to Cuba. This trip was life-changing, and I was honoured to be able to visit a number of different schools and organisations during the week-long trip. I learned so much about the Cuban education system and also about the values of Cuba as a society. It doesn't surprise me to hear that Cuba has managed to respond so well to the coronavirus pandemic. The Cuban response embodies everything that I learned while I was on the NEU delegation, and primarily that is that people come first. From the delegation, there were 3 words that have stuck with me since I returned from Cuba. And those 3 words are love, respect, and pride. And these, as I said, these words remained with me long after my return to the UK. And I learned that Cuba's education system, which is built around these fundamental values, and it's a shining example of how education could and really should be. There was a real passion within all of the educational establishments that we visited, and also the organisations. We saw that education is a high priority in Cuba. Cubans value their education because it means that they can contribute to society in a positive way. All of the children that we met had really high aspirations for themselves and their friends, and teachers are highly trained and respected throughout. Cubans are rightly proud of their world-class education system, and as delegates, we were blown away by what we witnessed during our visits. And most notably for all of us was the breadth of the curriculum, right from the early years through to secondary schools, and all of the amazing choices available to Cubans at university level. And one of the things that struck all of us was how highly the arts are valued in the school curriculum. In every school we visited, there was a performance where the students shared singing, music, dance, poetry, and incorporated all of the expressive arts, something that is often missing in our schools here in the UK. And the other part of Cuban life, which was really evident during our visit, was a real sense of community everywhere we went. And this sense of community was also evident within the education system. In Cuba, everyone is in agreement that education is not just a basic right, but it's a way to be part of and contribute to a meaningful society. It's about sharing what you have with others and making a better life for everyone. We saw this through the relationships that teachers had with parents and how family members were so involved in their children's school through committees, monthly meetings, joint projects, and they also had schools for parents so they could learn how to support their children at home. There was a real sense of collaboration between schools and within schools, everybody sharing, and that real sense of shared community. And obviously, as we heard from Niurka, this collaboration extended to the unions, who are involved at every level of planning within education, right up to the government level. As we've heard tonight, Cuba has responded in an organised and efficient way to the coronavirus pandemic. And the Cuban Education Union has been involved every step of the way to ensure that the children get the education that they deserve, but also to ensure that this is done in the safest possible way. I still find it really frustrating that in the UK, we as experienced teachers and trade unionists have no voice, and we're so often ignored when it comes to important decisions being made. This has been no different during the coronavirus pandemic. We've had to fight to be heard, and the government's response has fallen far short in terms of what our students deserve and what our education staff deserve. It was also wonderful to hear from Niurka about the importance of international solidarity to her and to other Cubans. They've consistently shown compassion and solidarity with other nations right from the start of this pandemic. They were the first and only country to offer help to the UK citizens stranded on a cruise ship in the Caribbean. They've sent medical brigades of doctors to Italy while the rest of the world looked on in horror. Not only was Cuba at the forefront of international solidarity by sending out its highly trained doctors, they've also been sending out vital medicines to other countries and working on developing a vaccine. And all of this is from a nation that very much is still developing and they're obviously subject to the awful US blockade. But what Cuba might lack in terms of wealth, it more than makes up for it in its commitment to humanity and its commitment to a better world for all. This will have come as no surprise to anyone who's had the fortune to visit the Caribbean island. When I visited Cuba myself, I was overwhelmed by the sense of love that permeates every aspect of Cuban society and culture. This love is at the heart of everything they do, whether that be their education system, their healthcare system, or their commitment to internationalism. And all of this despite the impact of the 60-year-long illegal blockade waged against Cuba by the US. But even in these desperate times, the US continues to target Cuba by withholding access to crucial medical supplies. Now more than ever, we should be learning from others. Cuba shines a beacon of hope in a time of darkness. No one has all the answers to this current crisis, but we can all take a moment to reflect and learn, and then change our practices based on what we have learnt. We have a lot to learn from Cuba in terms of the value that's placed on education and the way in which parents, teachers, unions, and local representatives all collaborate to make changes to the policies and curriculum. The Cubans are not naive. They know that what they have is not perfect, but they also know that they are able to make positive changes and work together to achieve their shared goal of a meaningful education for all. And this is an ideal that would be wholeheartedly welcomed within the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And I think what Lucy expressed there about the contrast between what she experienced in Cuba and our own education system, how little say we have over how education is governed here, and how much say both Cuban educators, but also the community in Cuba have over their schools, is something we've heard from so many of the delegates who've participated in those solidarity delegations. So thank you so much for those reflections, Lucy. Our final panel speaker that I would like to call in today is Malcolm Richards. Malcolm is another NEU member who's participated in delegation to Cuba in 2018 as well. But in addition to that, Malcolm is one of the editors of the book I mentioned earlier, Beyond the Blockade. Malcolm, we're really, really pleased that you're able to join us to share with us your reflections on Cuba, and I will hand over to you. The floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gawain. Thank you, Lucy, Bernard, and Niurka. I'm going to embarrass myself first of all by reading a very small statement, which I hope our family in Cuba will be able to understand. Saludas familia en Cuba, les estamos enviado amor, cuidado y solidaridad durante estos tiempos, which is meant to say, greetings family in Cuba, we are sending you love, care and solidarity during these times. It's really interesting that I think both Lucy and Bernard made reference to love, care and solidarity when they were speaking, and there was no collusion between us. And those are important words and values that are often used when we're talking about education, and often used when we're talking about difficult times, but certainly time and time again, and in the book that Gawain's been holding up, and I'm holding up a copy here of the Beyond the Blockade book, it's a theme that runs through everything that we say. And in these times of COVID and I guess real unsettling times in our schools and in education, they're words that we can really hold on to. My contribution today is going to really focus on one of the chapters in the Beyond the Blockade book, which spoke specifically about education, race and decolonization. The book was written before the events that we've seen this year, i.e. George Floyd and so many others, and the mass mobilization of people around the Black Lives Matters movement. But I'd like to read you just the opening sentence really of chapter 3, which says, in contemporary England and Wales schools, knowledge, pedagogy, and practice within our curriculum remains reference to a proximity of whiteness and the mandatory attainment of a dominant hegemonic ideal which is designed to other. Now, it may sound prophetic, but actually those words and those sentiments have been shared and referenced by educators across the UK, and certainly by Black educators in the UK for generations. One of the real motivations personally for me to go to Cuba was to go to the Caribbean. My family come from Guyana and St. Lucia. And so in many ways, though I was born in Britain, the Caribbean is home to me. But also as a member of a trade union and part of our trade union family, stories and tales of Cuba have long illustrated those principles of love, care, and solidarity that many of us talk about. We all know the famous images of Fidel and Che and others whose experiences, whose leadership, whose sacrifices we all hear and talk about. But what I was really interested in is understanding what that is really like. What does that look and feel like? So I was part of that 2018 delegation who were able to visit a range of education settings across Cuba, specifically in Havana and in Pinar del Rio. And as Lucy said, the trip was completely and utterly life-changing. And life-changing from that fundamental basis of those 3 points that I've made already, that it was for me the first time that I'd been in a formal education structure or system that placed love, care, and solidarity right at its heart and right at its center. And that's again a theme that comes out in all of the essays in the book. In chapter 3, we were really focused on race and decolonizing, really interested in, and in particular, the writers in that particular chapter, all of whom identify as Black, were really interested in ideas of race and racism. We've heard the stories of Cuba as being, of people being equal, and that enshrined in law, and that enshrined in everything that everybody does. But what does that actually look like? Is that really true? Is it something that we just hear when we go around on delegations, or is that something that ordinary people in Cuba were able to experience? Just thinking about some of our first reflections, we heard from Niurka earlier on, seeing Black women in leadership at the highest level and at every level of the Cuban education system was something that was awe-inspiring. And again, something that perhaps our Cuban family almost took for granted. Bernard referenced some of the kind of gasps and shock and awe of when questions were asked. So, for instance, on our delegation, we asked about, so what does racism look like? And universally, people said, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't understand. There isn't any racism because we're all Cuban. Now, my lived experience suggests to me that that's problematic. And certainly I, as many of the other authors in our book, had a critical eye when hearing that kind of discourse and those kind of discussions. We wanted to dig a little bit deeper, but just from a simple observation, as opposed to just looking and speaking to our delegation leaders who were very clear about this, we could see that something was very different within the various settings that we went to. Something was very different in the various shops and homes that we were invited to. And I'd probably locate those differences in 3 things. Wherever we went, and this was underpinned by the outstanding education system that Lucy and Bernard have already referred to, people knew their histories. The history of Cuba is known by everybody. But more than that, the history of the world in relation to Cuba is known by everybody. And when I say everybody, that could be from a 7 or 8-year-old child who, by the way, can speak to you in English as well as in Spanish. And you've seen evidence of my Spanish ability, to elders who are part of community organizations. And we saw that everybody was able to speak to and speak about the history of Cuba and the history of the world, the history of Britain in some instances, in relation to the Cuban experience. Now, if we think about some of the discourses that are being had around statues and memorials in this country at the moment, I would say that we have a lot to learn from Cuba. Bernard has already referenced some of the ways that Cuban communities have reinstituted their history. It doesn't mean that it's forgotten, it simply means that it's transformed. The second point that I'd make there is that principle of transformation is really, really important. And we have to acknowledge that transformation within education, within the context of the blockade. We have to recognize that transformation in the context of the kinds of economic pressures which are in many ways unbelievable. So back to that question of race and racism, many of the people that we spoke to spoke of their engagement with the education system, whether they were teachers or students. They spoke about the fact they went to university, but they spoke about the hardship that they went through, whether it was having to be a teacher, but also having other ways of having to support their families through work and through other means. And that reinforcement of it is hard, and it is hard because of the economic pressures from external agencies that are being brought to bear on the Cuban communities and all of Cuban communities. And so that idea of transformation and transforming difficult environments was really important. And the third thing I'd say was there was always an absolute emphasis on building communities. That's demonstrated in the communities that we saw and met with, through the ways in which community organizations and people in communities were banding together to support each other. That's absolutely demonstrated in the way that we have already seen and spoken about Cubans' international commitment to people in and around the world who are in need. And that comes back to those original points of love, care, and solidarity. In the context and in the heat of discourses around Black Lives Matters and race and racism in our school system, the voices of Black educators who went to Cuba and have written their narratives in a book, to me, are clear, which are that we absolutely saw difficulties around those conversations which relate to race and racism. We saw challenges around some of the ways in which some of our Afro-Cuban communities may be positioned within the hierarchies of Cuban society. But there is no direct comparison between that and the experiences within the structures and systems that we have in the United Kingdom and generally in the West. I recognize that time is not our friend, and I also want to give a lot of time to people to talk. During this time, many of us have begun to reflect on what race, decolonization, and education means. And we're seeking out a whole range of different books and ways of speaking and being and sources of information to help us on that journey. A shameless plug, the Beyond the Blockade book gives some really powerful narratives around Cuba and lessons that we can learn in education. But I also want to reference the words of a book that was given to me by one of my colleagues, one of my comrades on the group. I think it was Miss Carol, which is Grounders with My Brother by Dr. Walter Rodney. And in that book, which is a masterclass in terms of discourse and dialogue, which Walter Rodney speaks specifically to the Cuban experience. And I just want to, I guess, almost draw out a couple of points. And Dr. Walter Rodney speaks of Black Cubans or Afro-Cubans fighting alongside Cuban workers and peasants because they were all oppressed. Black Cubans enjoying political, economic, and social rights and opportunities the same as all Cubans, bearing arms in Cuba. In other words, white power in Cuba is ended. as opposed to getting hung up on that phrase white power and thinking about that kind of language, which was written in 1969 and updating it for our modern age and our Black Lives Matters movement, I would absolutely say that Cuba in many ways offers us a range of different ways of thinking, being, knowing about ourselves. For me, they are framed around that idea of knowing our histories, being brave to transform the environments of education that we're in, and committing to build our communities. In Cuba, we have to recognize that that is framed and bound by the blockade. And the most powerful narrative for me in the book was the words of some of the people that we met who said that, some of the Black Cuban communities who said, fundamentally and simply, it is the blockade that causes us the most pain because we are all Cubans and we are all affected by it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for the time, and thank you to our signer who probably had to work really hard there because I speak really quickly. Gracias.
Thanks so much, Malcolm, and for drawing attention to that absolutely vital component of understanding Cuban society around questions of race and decolonization within education in Cuba. And as Malcolm said, we are really, really pleased that we think the book we've published is probably the first time we've had the reflections of Black educators from this country reflecting on the questions of race, decolonization and education within Cuba. So we're really, really pleased that that is a crucial and core section within that book. So we've thank you to all of our panelists for opening up. I'd now like to put a number of questions to the three of you who are joining us live. Questions in already. If you'd like to submit more questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom. We may not be able to answer all, but we'll answer as many as we possibly can. So the first set I want to put, we've had a number of questions around Cuba that have been posed by people. So to give you just a couple of them, how are children with special educational needs supported in the Cuban education system? Is there additional adult support provided? And do they have special education schools in Cuba, or are they all included within a mainstream environment with additional support? So who would like to come in on that? I'm going to throw these questions out and let the three of you decide in what order you'd like to come in. So does anyone want to start special education in Cuba?
Shall I kick off?
Yes, Bernard, go for it.
Yeah. I'm sure Lucy and Malcolm will have a lot more to say, but just to say that there are special schools in Cuba. So as I said in the beginning, we visited one of those, Abel Santa Maria in Havana, which was a school for the visually impaired. But we have over the years visited other special schools. But I think what is the case is that the curriculum that the students follow in those institutions are the same as that which is followed in mainstream schools. And the hope and aspiration is that those children will return back to mainstream schools. I'm sorry to use that terminology, that perhaps shows my age, but you know what I mean, into non-special educational settings. So there is quite a lot of support. And I remember visiting one of the schools again in Pina del Rio, where there was a child with profound learning difficulties, and there was a teacher with the child all the time and an assistant. And at some parts during the week, the parent came in and was with the child as well. So I think there's very much a consciousness of looking at the question of special education in a holistic way, and recognizing that it isn't just about the child being in a formal educational setting, but about how that child feels confident to manage and cope with and control, hopefully, their ability to function in that kind of situation. So it's generally a positive one, but there are many challenges, and Niurka referred to some of them, which the NEU has been instrumental in supporting, and that has been the Braille machines, for example, that we have taken over, which have been really valued, and we know that's the case because when we've returned on subsequent visits, we've seen them being used. So they're a practical aid to the education there.
Thanks, Bernard. Lucy, Malcolm, would either of you like to add anything to what Bernard said?
Yeah, I would just say that when we visited the Abel Santa Maria school, they talked about how they had a range of specialists on site. So speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, everybody was there. And there was this real sort of holistic approach to education for all children, and the real sense of love for all children. So children's needs were met regardless of whether they were in a specialist school or in a mainstream school. And the other thing that struck me was that the teachers who taught children with special needs were the highest trained, and they would go into the mainstream schools to support teachers in helping children with special educational needs in those schools too.
Thank you. Malcolm, anything to add to that? I mean, the main points have maybe been covered.
No, it's fine. I'm unmuted. I think, again, understanding that because of that commitment to, I would describe it as lifelong learning, the educators across the Cuban system are highly trained, master's, PhD levels, with those specific trainings that Lucy mentioned. That coupled with an absolutely child-centered approach means that young people, regardless of their need, are being supported in a loving and caring environment. But it's also important to recognize that the resources that we would generally see as being kind of standard in a UK context are often simply just not available there. And so that, because of the blockade, and so it's important to kind of draw back to that reality as well.
Fantastic, thank you. We've also had a number of questions. Now, this may be difficult for our panelists. Obviously, you're based here, but we've had a number of questions about the response of Cuba during the pandemic in terms of education. Now, I know Niurka talked quite a bit about this, but there are just some questions around how has Cuban schooling worked during COVID? Have there been school closures? Do they have the issue of physical classrooms being too small for social distancing? I know one of the issues that's come up in a big way in this country, and where there have been school closures, are you aware of whether the schools remained open to the most vulnerable students, or what other support was put in place in those situations? Now, I know that may be difficult to answer here, but I'm going to come to you in the same order, if that's okay. From what you know, are you able to answer any of that? So Bernard, first of all.
Yeah, I mean, people may not know, but Cuba has WhatsApp. So I often have messages from friends who are teachers in Cuba. The only problem is that they usually start about 11 o'clock at night because of the difference in the time zones. So I'm just about to go to bed and they start up a conversation. But notwithstanding that, what Niurka said and is confirmed by my conversations with them is that schools were closed quite early. So the whole response to the pandemic was to very quickly operate a system of lockdown and tracking and tracing. And what they have in Cuba, they have an educational television channel, dedicated educational channel, which is available for children. And those children who are not able to have, they haven't got televisions at home or don't have access to it, were made, the local schools or the schools nearest to them was made available. So I know that there has been a continuity, albeit perhaps along the lines of the kind of blended learning that people have been talking about here, of a mix of contact and also, using various different kinds of media. And the intention is, as Niurka said, to open schools in September, but with all of the sort of safeguarding that we would want to see here as well. And I think probably teachers will tell me we're not yet confident 100% that that's what's going to happen. So there is some anxiety here. I think in Cuba that's not the case. I think all of the kind of physical safeguardings and so on. The classes in any case are smaller in Cuba, in general, both in primary and in secondary. They have usually 2 adults to about 30 children, if there are 30 in a class, but sometimes the classes are smaller than that. And similarly in primary schools, when we went to visit and you went into a classroom situation, it wasn't very often that you went in and found a teacher on their own. They were usually with another colleague working with them. So I think that idea of being able to disperse and to create smaller bubbles would be quite possible. So the intention is to go ahead in September. And I think there's been quite a bit of supporting in relation to that. I mean, I won't go into it now, but I've talked to friends in Italy, and I have to say there too, the government has been much more responsive in terms of providing computers for all children in schools in Italy, so that they can manage from day one when they were at home.
Thanks, Bernard. I think that has comprehensively answered that question of the response to the pandemic in terms of Cuban education. Lucy and Malcolm, do you mind if I pose a slightly different question to you? We've had some questions from the audience around the structure of Cuban education. So are all of the schools in Cuba state schools, or is there a private education system running in parallel to it? And how are the schools organized in Cuba? Is it similar to this country, or are there any major differences? Lucy, would you like to go first?
As far as I'm aware, there's no private schools in Cuba, and I think they would find the concept quite confusing because the education is provided by the state, so it's free for everybody from preschool right up to university. And in terms of the way it's organized, they have the preschools. It is fairly similar to here. They have preschools, primary schools, secondary schools, university. I think the difference is that I can't remember what age it is, but at a certain age, they get to choose whether they want to go to a specialist school. So if they performing arts, they can go to a music school and that kind of thing. And of course, that is all funded by the state as well. Maybe Malcolm might have a bit more to add.
You were spot on, to be honest, Lucy. I think it's kind of key stage 3, at the key stage 3 point. Students get to, in effect, kind of choose a particular pathway. We were really lucky enough to go and see students at a number of schools who were musical, but we were then and saw some just amazing practice dancing and so on and so forth, which of course Cuba is renowned for. But of course, as I remember, even within those different pathways, there are kind of different levels, and I have a vague recollection, and perhaps Bernard or Lucy or Grain will remind me, but we saw a glimpse of a ballet school which was connected to that pathway, where students who were Olympic standard were also housed. So there was almost a kind of really clear pathway dependent on students' choice and desires, but also kind of differentiated learning within that as well. So and that, though I focused on dance, I think that related to engineering and other streams. So it's almost vocational, but not, but also kind of dependent on that idea of love, care and solidarity. And as Lucy said, it's supported wholly and completely by the Cuban government.
Just
Thank
if I
you,
might add just to add a sentence to what Malcolm and Lucy have said. I mean, one of the things that struck me very strongly on one of the visits that we went on was the extent to which people in rural areas and remote areas were catered for. So it didn't matter that you were not in Havana or Santiago or one of the big cities. If you were had an aptitude and an interest and a desire to follow music or to follow dance or performing arts or science or any other specialism that you wanted to carry through, some of the schools operated as boarding schools so that children could go and stay there during the week and then go home to their families at the weekend, so that even though they were in remote areas, they could access all of the range of educational opportunities that any child in a city, and we know only too well that that doesn't happen in this country sometimes.
Fantastic, thanks, Bernard. The next question's been put specifically to Malcolm, but others may want to come in on it as well. One of our participants says, thank you very much for your thoughtful and critical insights. He's been wondering about, when you say the Cuban people know their history from a very young age, is it a truly critical history? Does it look at both the negatives and the positives, both in the pre-revolutionary period and since the Cuban Revolution? So is it a truly critical history that the Cuban children learn in schools?
Okay.
I'm going to start with Malcolm. Others may want to come in too.
In my conversations with teachers, trade unionists, ordinary people walking around the street, it absolutely offered a pre-1959 history as well as a post 59 history, but it didn't kind of just stop there. As I said before, it offered colonial context, it offered connection to indigenous communities of Cuba and the Caribbean. And I think it's really important to note that the histories, and I described that the histories that we were talking about were never, though related to the island of Cuba, were never disconnected to either the region or to global communities who clearly are a part of the Cuban story, in part through colonization and transatlantic slavery. So it was a critical view in my opinion, but I think it's, as I tried to say earlier on, it's really important to note other views of history were also known, which meant that with little younger children, teenagers or elders, you were able to have really powerful discussions and debates about those different views of histories, again, which is something that within a UK context we appear to be struggling with at the moment.
Thank you. Bernard, looks like you've got something to add there to Malcolm's contribution.
Sorry, Lucy,
No?
do you want to go?
No, you go, Bernard.
I remember very vividly going on perhaps one of the first, what was then the NUT, National Union of Teachers, prior to the National Education Union, delegation visits in 1996 or 7, I think, with Steve Sinnott, who was a previous General Secretary of the Union. And we had a meeting with the Teachers Union and we talked about the question of students and students' ability to influence things. And he told the then General Secretary, told us a story about how the students were complaining because they felt that they were taught history in what we would describe as quite a rote fashion of dates and events and in that sort of way. And they wanted to understand more. So they actually had the facility, and this is maybe something the NEU will have to think about. The students had a facility to take a resolution to their teachers' union conference to say to them, we want to discuss about the curriculum, which I thought was brilliant. It's quite revolutionary. But just to add to that, I mean, it doesn't answer fully the question, but I think is important, is that in all of the schools, there are student representatives on the school management body or the governing body, or I don't know what the exact term would be, but the equivalent of a school governing body. And they have the right on that body to, well, first of all, they represent the students. So they get their mandate from the students and the students will ask them to put things forward, but they have the right to take those things to the governing body to seek those kind of changes. And I think that the example that I gave, I'm sure could be replicated in other examples as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to add to what's been said by the panelists, a further plug for the book actually, but there's a whole section of reflections in Beyond the Blockade. There's an entire section on education and democracy with chapters on the Cuban democratic system, but also on Cuban trade unions, on education and the working class, on the status of women within Cuba and within Cuban education, and on children's rights and participation, within the democratic systems and within education. So there's a lot more information and a lot more answers there about how the Cuban system relates to democracy and education and how those link together within Cuba. Lucy, I'd like you to come in first on the next set of questions. We've got a couple of questions here, again, relating to what you talked about quite a lot about contrasting Cuba and Britain. The first one is, as the Cuban experience is about solidarity and pride, how might this become a part of British society to give education the status that it deserves? And secondly, do you think we could ever have such an education in this country, given that there is love in the children and their teachers, but sadly in Britain this is squashed by those in control and with the power? So could we ever be like the Cuban system? And Lucia, I'd like to bring you in first on that, although I will come to the others after.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I really hope that we could, and I really do think that we should, because what the Cubans have got in their education system is really quite wonderful and unique. And I think that the interesting thing is how much teachers are trusted and respected in Cuba. And I think if we could, as trade unionists, push for teachers to be given that trust and that respect, then we certainly could achieve that. And I think the more autonomy that teachers are given over the curriculum, the more we would be able to achieve the solidarity, shaping what is within our curriculum. And I think that we have glimmers of that in our education system, but little pockets of that. But it really depends on who your head teacher is or who your governing body is and how much autonomy as a teacher you're given. And I think I'm an early years teacher, and I think actually in early years we do have an awful lot of those positives, but sadly we're losing a lot of that because the government are driving for more testing. They're driving for instant recall of facts even from the age of 4. So I think what we need to do as teachers is stand up for our profession and stand up for our education system, and then we really could have what Cuba has.
Thank you, Lucy. Malcolm, Bernard, anything to add to that?
Do you want to go, Bernard?
Sorry, Malcolm, go on.
I was going to ask for a reminder of the questions again, to be honest.
It was, can we ever have an education system like Cuba does? Because here the love for the children exists, but it's squashed by those in power.
In terms of our individual, and I'm going to start there with our individual practice as educators in classrooms, working with communities of students and families and peers, we absolutely can have love, care and solidarity at the heart of everything we do. And if we haven't, we need to be working towards having that as a minimum standard. In order for that to become embedded in our system, in my opinion, requires radical transformation of what I would describe as a hostile environment. But in order to radically transform any hostile environment, we have to begin with ourselves and our own practice. And that requires reflection. But that also requires solidarity in the ways in which we challenge, support, and engage with structures which are hostile here in the UK and elsewhere. So we start with us, and then we continue the work together. I guess I said I don't think so is the answer, without significant transformative work.
Thanks, Malcolm. Bernard, a brief reflection?
Well, it's a bit outside my remit in a sense, but I hope you'll forgive me for saying, I think the development of the Black Lives Matter campaign and the debates that have emerged around that about decolonizing education are absolutely have a potential dynamic for challenging the kind of rigors that we see in the British education system, so that, as Lucy said, transformative education is not simply the consequence of the goodwill of a particular head teacher, but is actually organic to the whole process, that it's something that we can all as educators engage with. And it's slightly aside from our subject matter, but I think the Black Lives Matter has the potential not only of addressing the issues of injustice against Black communities, but also transforming the education system for all children.
Thank you so much, Bernard. I've got just one final question for our panelists, and I'm going to ask you to be really, really brief. So if you can manage it in one sentence each, please. And the question is this: how can we get involved in the Cuba Solidarity campaign, and what can we do from this country to help support solidarity with Cuba? And I'm going to go to Malcolm first.
Join a trade union, join CSC, inform yourself about words, life, and living in Cuba through any means necessary.
Excellent, thank you. Lucy, what can we do to support the campaign?
Yeah, educate yourself and attend as many. Cuba Solidarity have amazing events. They're always putting things on. Get involved with your local Cuba Solidarity campaign group and tell people about Cuba, talk about Cuba and put it on the agenda. Yeah.
Thank you. Bernard, what can people do to support the campaign?
Join the campaign, affiliate your district to the campaign, raise the issue in any other fora that you're active in, and also become involved in initiatives which we have. So, for example, at the moment we are calling for the British government to stand firm in solidarity with the Cuban people against the blockade. We're calling for recognition of the achievements and contributions of the Cuban medics who have been around the world helping fight coronavirus, and the call for the Nobel Peace Prize. You will get a regular Cuba update, which will keep you informed of initiatives that we're engaged with. But above all, become involved in the campaign and take it into your schools as well as into your union branches. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard, and thanks to all our panelists, both for their contributions and for answering all of those questions. I'm now really, really pleased. I did say at the beginning that we were joined this evening by a very special guest. I'm really, really pleased to welcome to the panel to say just a few words to us, Her Excellency Barbara Elena Montalvo Alvarez, the Cuban ambassador. Barbara, you are very, very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm very, very warm greeting for all, especially to the NEU's participants. For me, it's very important to know you, even if it's virtually, and I'm confident that soon we can meet personally. Congratulations for this initiative, because the title could not be better. Another education is possible, and I don't think only in the Cuba experience, but in a more wide sense, because educating is not only teaching, transmitting knowledge, stimulating research, desire to improve professionally and in life. It's also to teach values that contribute to the formation of a better human beings. And from this vision, the teacher becomes an educator, as we call them in Cuba. And you know, education is a very one's right, which we must defend permanently. In the case of Cuba, despite our advances, I think there are much more to do. I take this opportunity to express our gratitude to those who work in beyond the blockade. Malcolm, they do an excellent job, which helps to understanding what we are in Cuba and what we try to do in Cuba. And all of you know how much we appreciate this effort. there is a very special reason why this moment satisfies me a lot. And it's because I'm a daughter of a woman who was a teacher. She was a very passionate teacher who kept working till her last moment. She lived to educate, and nothing made her happier than the achievements of the revolution in this fight. So this event and this wonderful exchange reminds me a lot of my mother. On behalf of all Cuban educators, thank you very much for this productive and encouraged exchange and for your permanent support.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and we are proud to stand in solidarity with you and with your people. Thank you so much to all our panelists and to everyone who's joined us at this meeting. Thanks also to Sam Riddle for providing the BSL interpretation. But before you go, please don't leave us yet. Please make sure you register for the next Cuba Solidarity Zoom meeting, which is on Monday at 6:30 p.m. with Jeremy Corbyn and also Fernando Gonzalez, one of the Cuban 5 heroes. They'll be talking about solidarity and resistance, 60 years of internationalism in Cuba. And it just remains for me to wrap up with a few final words. Lucy referred in her contribution to Cuba as a beacon of hope. And I think it is our responsibility as educators and as trade unionists to stand alongside the Cuban people, to protect and to promote that beacon of hope, and to make sure that it is not extinguished by the illegal US blockade, but rather that Cuba's example, Cuba's internationalism can be spread and shared with the rest of the world. We stand in solidarity with the Cuban people and with our sister union in Cuba. And what can we do practically? Well, I'd urge you, when you leave this meeting, please go and join the Cuba Solidarity campaign. And please make sure, if it's not already, that your union branch affiliates to the campaign. Please do get a copy of Beyond the Blockade to find out more about Cuba and the experience of the Cuban education system. Please also encourage your union branch to buy copies and sell them on to members so that we can promote that experience more widely. But most importantly of all, please keep speaking up for Cuba. Please speak up for the Cubans' right to independence. Please speak up against the blockade. Please speak up in solidarity with the people of Cuba. Thank you so much for joining us today.